Thank you. I'm also delighted to say we are joined this morning by two representatives from the Climate Change Commission who are non-elected and non-voting members appointed to this committee. They are Martin Mathers, sorry Martin, and Richard Oram. Thank you and welcome. I will now ask Adam to confirm any apologies received and to take a roll call of members in attendance. Adam.
Thanks, Convener. We've had no apologies submitted this morning, so I'll just quickly run through who we've got present in the chambers and then ask those present online just to confirm that they're here. In the chambers this morning, we've got Councillor Anderson, Councillor Liz Barrett, Councillor Cuthbert, Councillor Illingworth, Councillor Kogali, Councillor Lang, Councillor McEwen, Councillor Grant Stewart and yourself, Councillor Waters. Can I just ask Councillor Reid to confirm if he's online?
He's online, yeah. Good morning to you all.
And Councillor Welsh?
Yes, I can confirm I'm online. Thank you.
Thank you. That's everybody present, Convener.
Thank you, Adam. Can I ask if there's any declaration of interest? No declarations of interest. And can I remind councillors and officers joining us virtually to use the chat box to attract my attention. Those present in the chamber, can you just raise your hand, please? Thank you. First item, can we look at the minutes from our last meeting held on the 24th of August 2022? Hi, Noah. Noah?
Yeah, it's just if we could have an update, please, on the progress on the Second Amendment from last time. I know we agreed it didn't have to be brought back to this meeting, but if just an update on the Second Amendment from the electric charging paper would be appreciated.
I'm not sure. Do we have officers online? Barbara Renton's going to take that. Thanks.
Councillor Kigali, I can confirm that work has started on the second tranche of the EV work via our consultants Urban Foresight. This work will set the direction of travel for our future EV facilities and will likely bring in options for the council to consider in terms of the role of the private sector and, importantly, facilities for on-street and residential areas. It's likely to be spring before the works are ready to be put up to the committee or the council to consider. Hope that helps.
Councillor Grant Lane.
Thanks. I think it is a very important issue that we move on with this quite quickly, and it's good that Councillor Kogali raised it again, because our infrastructure does seem to be getting kind of time expired, and there's nothing more frustrating for people if they can't get charged. So I'm glad to hear that that is going to be moving forward early in the new year, and with involvement hopefully of procurement through the private sector, we'll be able to offer a more diverse range of where people can go for charge with maybe faster charging as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Your points are both noted on the need to move forward with this as fast as we possibly can. Thanks. If there's no more comments or questions on the minutes, we will move on to the first item. It's a presentation on flood risk management, and I'm going to hand over to Peter Dixon.
Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Presentation is there. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Dixon. I'm the interim flooding manager with the council's community service. Work with the council's flooding team. So it's a quick presentation this morning about the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act, and it's a committee report we're going to put up next month. So it's just an advanced briefing on that, and it's about the publication of our final reports under the Flood Act and the publication of our local flood risk management plans. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just by way of introduction, I'll run quickly through a bit of background with the Flood Act, give you a bit of an update on the public consultation that was carried out on our flood risk management plans last year, a brief update on the publication of SEPA's flood risk management plans. They were published in December last year. And then we'll move on to talk about our final reports for the last 6-year period between 2016 and 2022, and then the proposed local flood risk management plans that we'll be publishing next month, looking ahead at the next 6 years up to 2028. And then we'll just cover briefly some conclusions, next steps. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, Perth and Kinross, we've had quite a big history of flooding in the council's area. I suppose one of the key floods was back in 1993 in Perth itself and the wider Tay catchment, which was a fairly serious flood event that sort of culminated in the implementation of the Perth flood scheme. And flooding's continued to other areas in the catchment, including Comrie in 2012 and Ayleth in 2015. So, you know, these have been quite an ongoing, quite a devastating impact. Next slide, please. And this is continuing to the current day. We had quite severe flooding, probably the worst flood since the 1993 flooding back in August 2020. Affected quite a number of communities, and what we've noticed is an increase in the sort of rapid urban type of flooding, kind of flash floods, which can quite often happen in the middle of summer, not the time you would expect them to happen. And you know, it's just indicative really of climate change and the impact that climate change is having on the increased prevalence and frequency of flooding. And we've seen it again just a couple of months back in Perth and Bridge of Erne on the 8th of September with another event which had quite a big impact as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we are, we're current and future flood risk. SEPA produced the National Flood Risk Assessment back in 2018. And under that, they discovered that the numbers of properties at risk of flooding had increased. Now, at the time, that was considered mainly due to advances in the assessment methodologies they used, not particularly because of a big change in the actual risk of flooding. But in Perth and Kinross, they estimated that 8,700 properties are currently at risk of flooding. That equates to 1 in 12 residential properties and 1 in 7 businesses. And by 2080, they've estimated that about 12,000 properties could be at risk due to climate change. So it's becoming quite a big problem, and it's only going to get worse. Next slide, please. But the good news is that there are things we can do about this. So council's got quite a good record. We've got 6 flood schemes in place now. The most well-known ones obviously in Perth. And there's a couple of other pictures there of the flood protection works we did up in Comrie back in 2012, when we've just started the wider flood scheme up there at the moment, and we've finished the Bank flood scheme as well. We've got other flood defences in Bridge of Erne, Milnathort and Weem near Aberfeldy. So there are things that can be done to try and manage flooding. Next slide, please. It's important to point out as well that although the public authorities, SEPA, Scottish Water, local authorities have a bit of a role in flooding, meant to take a proactive role to try and manage and where possible lowering flood risk. Obviously the responsibilities still lie with land and property owners as well. And what we tend to find is in communities where everyone can kind of work together, the councils and other authorities doing what they can, working with community groups, community councils and businesses and residents. If we can all work together, we can all achieve a bit more. So the Flood Act is definitely aimed at trying to get that kind of joint action going. Next slide, please. So in terms of how flooding's managed across Scotland, we have what's known as local planned districts. The country's been split up to 14 catchments. and there's partnerships in place in each of those 14 catchments. So SEPA, Scottish Water, the relevant local authorities all work together in those areas. And in the Tay catchment, we work with the national parks because they've got a planning authority involvement there, and also Scottish Forestry, Forestry and Land Scotland now. So there's 10 different authorities that are actually working to tackle flood risk in Tayside. There's lead local authorities in each area. Perth Cross Council is the lead authority for the Tay district, and we also have an involvement in the Tay Estuary, the Forth and the Forth Estuary districts as well. So those 4 catchments that we work in, we have to have a flood risk management plan and a local flood risk management plan for each of those, and interim and final reports, reporting on progress every 3 years and every 6 years. So it's not just one area that we're working in, we're quite spread across quite a wide geographical area. Next slide, please. And within those catchments, those local plan districts, the Flood Act requires us to identify what's known as potentially vulnerable areas, and that's been done and updated in 2018 by the second National Flood Risk Assessment. And these are the areas where we have significant flood risk that occurs or is likely to occur. They're kind of shown as the brown shaded areas on the plan on the right hand side there. So there's 235 of these been identified in Scotland, and in Perth and Kinross we've got 17. 14 of those are in the Tay district, 1 in the Tay Estuary, 1 in the Forth, and 1 in the Forth Estuary district. So that's how we manage flooding. Next slide, please. And just to confuse everyone even more, there's a third designation now. We've now got the introduction of what's known as objective target areas, or OTAs, identified in the second National Flood Risk Assessment as well. And these are areas within the potentially vulnerable areas, sort of hotspots, if you like, of where flood risk occurs, and where we need specific objectives and actions to try and manage or reduce the risk of flooding. And these are really now the focus of attention and national investment, and in Perth and Kinross we've got 22 of these, again the majority of them in the Tay district, and they're shown on the right hand side there, the kind of circulate the little yellow boundaries. So again, much more defined areas within the potentially vulnerable areas where a lot of the focus will take place. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're trying to achieve, sustainable flood risk management that the Act is looking for, and that's really a joined up and coordinated approach, all the different authorities and local communities trying to work together to do what they can. It's a catchment management approach, so we don't just work within local authority boundaries anymore. It's hydrological catchments. We're working across boundaries, so that does require partnership working. We're all setting out actions to try and tackle flood risk as best we can. We look at a variety of actions now. It's not just responding after flood events have happened. It's a plan-led approach, and we look at different actions. So it could be the kind of things shown on the right-hand side there, working from right up in the top of the catchment down to where rivers meet the sea, land management techniques. It could be flood defences, flood storage areas. It could be non-structural type actions using planning policies or flood warning and those kind of things. So there's really a number of different techniques are used depending on the level of flood risk in which catchment you're in, and we try and select the best actions in those areas to try and tackle the identified flood risk. Next slide, please. And the process gives us various outputs. So I've already mentioned the National Flood Risk Assessment, which gets reviewed every 6 years and redone. There's an ongoing process from that of producing flood maps right across Scotland for river flooding, coastal flooding and surface water flooding. And they inform the flood risk management plans, which we produce. And there's 2 levels of those. There's the SEPA plans and there are local flood risk management plans, which are local authority led. Next slide, please. So in terms of this framework that we have, this repeats every 6 years. We've had the National Flood Risk Assessment back in December 2018. That was published, consulted on. There's been a flood mapping update 2 years after that in 2020. SEPA published their flood risk management plans last December, so they're online and available to view. We are currently working to get the final drafts of our local flood risk management plans together, and they have to be published next month. So we'll be coming to committee to approve those prior to publication. And thereafter, for the 6-year period after that, it's really the implementation of the actions that we set out in the plans. And this process of risk assessment, mapping and planning repeats every 6 years. We'll obviously gather in knowledge and information about flood risk through that, trying to improve the way we do things, implement the actions, and hopefully over time try and manage flood risk in Scotland. We try and reduce flood risk, but obviously climate change is having an effect to increase flood risk all the time. So it's kind of outstripping what we're trying to do. So it's very difficult to try and overcome that general trend. Next slide, please. So in terms of our current priorities in this process, we reported on our proposed cycle 2 actions for the next 6 years to the E&I committee on the 19th of May last year. And those actions were then put out to public consultation between July and October last year. And the SEPA then published their cycle 2 flood risk management plans in December. And we are currently on with trying to finalise our cycle 1 final report. So that's the progress reports looking back at the last 6 years and how we've got on. We've looked at all the actions again that we set out in 2016. We've given them a red, amber, green status, and that'll be in the final reports that come to committee next month. At the same time, also drafting our next round of local flood risk management plans. They'll cover the next 6-year period. So they'll set out the objectives and actions for managing flood risk, and we're also working on the strategic environmental assessment and the habitats regulations assessments for those, and that'll be in the committee report next month as well. So there'll be a report to this committee next month to wrap all of this up before publication prior to 31st December. Next slide, please. So just one slide here on the public consultation that was carried out last year on this. The arrangements for that public consultation, again, were approved by the E&I committee last May. That was a national web-based exercise carried out jointly with SEPA and all the local authorities in Scotland and Scottish Water. It was done in a phased approach. There was some initial information put online in December 2020, just the sort of characterisation information, the levels of flood risk, the PVAs, the OTAs, all that kind of basic information. And then further information was added between July and October last year on the proposed objectives and actions for the next 6 years. So in Perth Kinross Council, we've had 35 responses on that. And those responses have obviously been used by SEPA to inform their published plans, and will also inform our plans that will be published next month as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of what consultees said, still sort of looking at this a little bit and just trying to draw the thread out of it, but I suppose the common themes were concerns around ongoing flooding in various areas, flooding's having an increased frequency. Perth came up quite a few times. It's probably the place where we got most comments from, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. Some comments came in about flood affected areas that were outside of PVAs, and we have actions obviously getting set in the PVAs and the OTAs now, but we also have actions set right across the whole district. So I think people were a bit concerned that nothing was going to be done in the areas, but that's definitely not the case. Some comments about timescales, seeking clarification on timescales, and they will be in the published plans next month. And obviously people requesting that we accelerate works, that everyone looking for things to be done now. They really want things done quickly, if at all possible. And development came up as quite a frequent concern. People kind of perceiving that development in towns and cities has increased flood risk as well. And we have actions in the flood risk management plans to look at development and try and manage the flood risk from development as well. So any concerns raised are really considered to have been addressed by the development of SEPA's flood risk management plans and the actions that's going to be set out in our local flood risk management plans, and that's the studies, the flood schemes, and our ongoing flood risk management responsibilities. So while a lot of concerns have been raised, I think the plans we consulted on were generally fit for purpose and don't really need to be changed too much to address the consultation comments. Next slide, please. So just a quick one on SEPA's plans. These were published December last year, obviously cover the 14 local plan districts in Scotland. And they set out the objectives and actions to be implemented by SEPA and local authorities, Scottish Water, etc. Over the next 6 years. We'll have input to 4 of those districts, which are listed there, and those actions are really consistent with what we reported to the E&I committee on 19th of May. So nothing's changed in terms of the actions that we've put forward. And those flood risk management plans are available online on SEPA's website at the web address provided there. Next slide, please. So moving forward for ourselves, one of the big key outputs we need to get to committee and publish next month is our final reports. So these are a follow-up to the interim report we did 3 years ago, and those interim reports are done at the midpoint of the 6-year cycle, and they were published on the Council's website in March 2019. So to produce the final report, this is at the end of the 6 years now. We're looking back over the entire 6-year period, and these have to be published by a revised date set by the Scottish Ministers, which is 31st of December. So these are developed again in partnership with SEPA and other responsible authorities, and they set out the progress that were made in implementing the actions in the published flood risk management plans. Any actions that weren't implemented, and we'll also give a progress update on any other action taken. Next slide, please. So it's an assessment of progress against the dates that were set out in June 2016. And for each of the actions, we've allocated a green, amber or red status. Green, everything's good, action's been completed. If it's been given an amber status, it usually means it's commenced, it's perhaps behind programme. And if it's a red status, this means the action hasn't commenced. I have to say we do have some amber and red actions. Most of them are just continuing on into cycle 2, so they will be delivered just later than anticipated, really. Next slide, please. So in terms of the initial conclusions from the final reports, we do have final drafts of these now. The kind of conclusions we come to, obviously the introduction of the Flood Act has led to improved partnership working and data sharing between the various authorities. However, that has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, the move to home working and the cyber attack in SEPA that happened December 2020, I think that was. The published plan that we've got in the Tay district with the lead authority for that certainly remain current and relevant. The progress summary that we've got is out of the 182 selected actions. Most of them have continued and been delivered. A lot of them are ongoing. Some of them relate to statutory duties, just ongoing things that we do day to day. So 156 of those were given a green status, 22 were the amber and 4 that red. And I think most of the amber and red actions, as I say, will continuing on into cycle 2. So since publication in June 2016, generally we've had good progress made over the sort of first 3 or 4 years of the cycle. Bit of a slow start due to storms Frank and Desmond mainly. Some staff resources had to complete ongoing other actions that we had at the time in the flood schemes and do some public consultation that we had on the go. So it was a bit of a slow start for the first few months. Next slide, please. We did have initial issues with securing consultancy services to do a lot of the schemes and studies. I think that was a bit of a national problem at the time. It's since calmed down a bit. And then we got on better after that, after the
We seem to have lost Peter just there. We'll just give it a minute or so and see if he can get reconnected to the meeting. While we're waiting, I'm just looking for the committee for approval. Part of these updates on the cycle 1 flood management reports and the cycle 2 ones which need to be produced by and submitted by the end of the year. And it was just with your permission, if we could arrange an extra committee meeting. I think we're looking around about the 15th of December so that we can actually scrutinise and have a look at these reports before they're submitted to the Scottish Government.
Obviously, sorry, convener. Obviously, if we have to do that to put them in, and if it's relating on funding or whatever as well moving forward, it'd be remiss of us as a committee not to organise a meeting to meet the deadline, I would have thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah, David. Thanks. And Adam will have a look at some dates and get back to everybody on that. Thank you. Peter, are we back?
Sorry?
I was checking to see if Peter Dixon's managed to get connection again.
I hope he has, because he's got a flood of questions to answer on this.
I was probably still talking.
Aye. Can I just request for after just a quick 5-minute recess until we can get Peter connected again. Thank you. online. If we can just return to our seats and we'll get started. Thank you, Grant. Thanks for your patience there. We'll go back to Peter Dixon to finish off his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, convener. So apologies for that, everyone. I have no idea what happened there. The connection just went. So yeah, I was given just a brief update on some of the conclusions from our final reports from the last 6 years. We obviously were getting better progress through the flood risk management set up during post 2016 and into 2019, and we made quite good progress on schemes and studies in particular. But unfortunately, with the introduction March 2020, the national COVID lockdowns, and then with a really severe flood event in August 2020, that really progress took a bit of a hit at that time, and that's delayed quite a few things. But thankfully, a lot of our flood studies that we set out are complete or ongoing. There's only 2 of them to commence, and as I say, we'll continue them into the next cycle over the next few years. Progress in the larger, sort of more complex projects, the flood schemes, has unfortunately been further delayed as well. Although we did complete the Almond Bank flood scheme back in 2018, and the construction of our further flood scheme in Comrie has commenced. And obviously, we just always make a general point that the authorities who are working in the Tay catchment are also working in other areas as well. So we tend to find our resources are split, and when we're not just working in any one particular community, it's across a number of communities. So quite often, progress can appear slow, but we are working as quickly as we can over quite a wide area and try to deliver quite a high number of actions. Next slide, please. So the other main set of documents we're working on is obviously the local flood risk management plans, and these are for the next 6 years, so we're looking forward now. And these are consistent with SEPA's plans, which were published in December last year. So these will cover the period 2022 up to 2028. They'll be published by the end of the year. And they really have 2 elements to them. There's a supplementary part, which is supplementary to SEPA's plans. So our local plans have to be consistent with those flood risk management plans that SEPA produce. And then we take the actions that are set out in those flood risk management plans. And in our local plans, we have an implementation part which sets out the responsibilities for all the actions, the timescales for implementing them, and the funding arrangements. So these are documents are delivered in partnership with all the authorities that I've mentioned, and they're informed by public consultation. And we end up with the kind of information you see on the right-hand side there, each particular action, setting out what it is, what the objectives are, what the kind of priority of the action is, the description of it, and then the funding timescales, all those different arrangements. That's what we're producing at the moment. Next slide, please. So in terms of the content of what will be in these plans, we'll have catchment characterisation, just setting out the degree of flood risk in different geographical areas in these potentially vulnerable areas and objective target areas. We've set all that out, the main rivers, the surface water, flood risk, coastal flood risk, whatever it might be. We then set objectives to try and manage that identified flood risk, and the objectives have really come from the second national flood risk assessment back in 2018. That gave us the updated PVAs and the OTAs, these main areas that we need to focus on. The objectives are also set to cover any ongoing actions that we have. There's studies and schemes that we're still working on, and also looking at the outcome from any flood studies that we did in cycle 1. So we've had some flood studies recommending flood schemes, and the objectives just tend to look, they're fairly simple, just things like reduce the risk of river flooding from the Craigieburn and Perth, and we then go on and set the actions to try and achieve those objectives. And there's a couple of slides to follow to describe the actions. The actions are prioritised where we can, and as I said, we set out the responsibilities for who's to deliver them and the timescales and funding arrangements as well. Next slide, please. So the actions we look at, this is quite a long list here, there's quite a lot on this, but they're really in two groups. There are general actions that apply right across the whole of the Tay catchment and the Forth catchment, the Forth estuary, Tay estuary. They apply really everywhere. So things like awareness raising, SEPA now have actions to look at data to support climate resilience. We've got emergency planning. We've got flood forecasting, flood warning, a lot of new guidance going to get developed to look at various aspects of flood risk management, the flood mapping that I've already mentioned that gets redone on the 6-year cycle. Land use planning, the plan systems looked at to try and avoid flood risk, avoid development of flood risk areas where we can. We have maintenance actions, so we obviously Scottish Water maintain their sewer networks, we clear and repair water courses where we need to, roads drainage gets maintained, private landowners do maintenance as well, and then we have self-help, which is really trying to help individuals and businesses become more resilient to the effects of flooding. So those apply everywhere, but within the objective target areas, we've got specific actions that we apply. So those could be flood schemes or flood protection works, sort of flood studies that we do, which lead to flood schemes and flood defences. Surface water management plans to look specifically at this kind of rapid urban type of flash flooding that we get. We might be maintaining an existing flood protection scheme where relevant, and then things like community engagement, community resilience groups, maintaining flood warning schemes, that's for SEPA to do. And we'll look at adaptation plan and Scottish Water carry out sewer flood risk assessments as well. So these actions are really selected and applied to each of the objective target areas as required. Next slide, please. So just to talk specifically about flood schemes, we've got a programme of flood schemes ongoing from Cycle 1 and continued into Cycle 2. And these were set out back in 2016. There's a national priority list of 42 schemes identified. And the Scottish Government agreed at that point to fund those, provide up to 80% capital grant on those, with local authorities making up the remainder of the 20% from capital programmes. Now we've got 4 flood schemes in there at the moment. Flood scheme in Comrie, which was number 7 on the national priority list, and construction work on that has started. Small scheme in Milnathort, which is kind of getting towards the end of the outline design stage in that and moving into public consultation next year. Another scheme in South Kinross, which is at a kind of similar stage as well, and a small scheme in Scone. We've actually yet to commence, we haven't got to that one yet. We had looked at a surface water measure in Bridgend and Perth, which at the time of publishing the last set of flood risk management plans, we hadn't done an economic appraisal on that yet. We have done that now, so we've had to add that into the Cycle 2 flood schemes that we've got. Next slide, please. Now, at the moment with flood schemes, the Scottish Government and COSLA are carrying out a review of capital funding because the cost for the 42 flood schemes across Scotland has increased. A lot of them were identified at a kind of post-feasibility stage. And as the design of these is developed, the costs have increased. So Scottish Government's had to look at the available funding that they've got, and they've had to prioritise these as well. So in terms of how that impacts on Perth and Kinross, our Cycle 1 flood schemes in Comrie, Milnathort and South Kinross are ongoing. They're just to continue as planned. Funding is in place for them, both from terms of the Scottish Government capital grant and in terms of the funding within the Council's capital programme as well. The Scone flood scheme, the small scheme there, will progress at a later stage because there's insufficient funding in the Scottish Government's capital grant at the moment for that. But the Scottish ministers have written to COSLA to basically say still committed to delivering all these flood schemes. It might just take a bit longer to identify and allocate the funding to these schemes. So that's for Cycle 1. For Cycle 2, we have identified new schemes in Pitlochry, Aberfeldy and Blackford. There's another committee report about Blackford this morning. And the measure in Bridgend, Perth, as I've mentioned, but there's no funding for those schemes yet, either within the Scottish Government COSLA setup or within the Council's capital programme. So there's no clarity around when we'll be able to deliver those schemes at this time, and the progress on those remains subject to funding. So they will be in the plan, they are in SEPA's plan, but any work on them will remain subject to capital funding. Next slide, please. So as well as the flood schemes, we've got a programme of flood studies. There's a number of those are ongoing at the moment. One in Dunkeld, one almost finished. There's a joint project we're doing with Scottish Water in Perth, which is winding its way towards a conclusion as well. We've got ongoing studies in Ailith and for the Craigieburn in Perth. We'll have further studies following on and running cycle 2 for Scone, which was a cycle 1 study, Perth, and then new studies Bridge of Erne, Lunkerty, Blair Athol and Methven. There's also a programme of surface water management plans to purely look at surface water flooding, this flash flooding we're getting in urban areas. We've got those being developed already in Milnathorpe, Perth, and a new one just started in Blairgowrie and Rattray in the last couple of months. We'll be progressing other surface water management plans in Scone, Comrie, Kinross and Aberfeldy. And the draft local flood risk management plans will set the timescales for those, but the kind of listing there provided is going to be the general order of priority, and they've been prioritised in terms of the level of flood risk, the number of properties we understand to be at risk in the various communities. So understandably Perth would probably be, featuring quite heavily in the initial priorities, and some of the smaller communities will follow at a later stage. Next slide, please. So in terms of just to wrap up our conclusions and next steps, obviously be a report to this committee next month, and hopefully the committee will approve the final reports and the local flood risk management plans. That's 8 documents for those to get published, and they'll be published prior to the 31st December next month. After that, we continue to implement the actions set out in the plans and the local plans, and then we will come back to committee with an interim report between the midpoint of June 2024 and the midpoint of 2025, with an interim report on progress. And in the meantime, we'll be commencing work with SEPA, Scottish Water, etc. on cycle 3. So the National Flood Risk Assessment will get updated again. Flood maps will continue to be developed, and there'll be new flood risk management plans and local flood risk management plans eventually as well. So that's it. Last slides, just to invite any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was appreciated, and I'm sure it'll be a good prelude to the full paper when it comes in December before committee. Peter, would it be okay to make the slides available to committee members?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? If you can just either put your hand up or a question in a queue in the chat function. And Councillor Hugh Anderson.
Hello, just as probably going down memory lane as such. I remember that photograph of North Muirton being taken. I was a short distance away from it in '93. I was convener of leisure and recreation for my sins at that time, and visited North Muirton over that period quite a lot. I remember going around with Lord James Douglas Hamilton, who was Minister of State for Scotland at that time, in a house as in North Muirton. Things have changed a lot since then. I haven't seen on the scheme all the different schemes we're taking on now. Perth was a major scheme, but even the costs.
Do you have a?
Costs, I think
we will come to. Do you have any question, Councillor Anderson?
The question, how? Well, I'm pleased now that we are getting a number in the 90s, etc., with all these surveys of flood prevention, where flood dangers, housing, and everything else, where you were not allowed to build or possibly not build. That's all gone before planning does consider flooding. Now we can refuse houses because of flooding. So hopefully it will make things much less dangerous in future. Makes it easier for our boys who are designing these flood prevention schemes that they. I do need
a question, Councillor Anderson. That were.
Yeah, well, so it's not a question, more just commented how things much have changed and too much for the better for us all now.
Thank you. I'm sure Peter Dixon will take on board. Councillor Kugali, you have a question?
Well, I've got 3, but if there's other, do you want me to just go first one or rattle through all 3?
Can you do the first one first?
Yes. So both of the schemes in the paper say there is 0.5% risk of flooding or 1 in 200 years. How much has that changed in the past 10, 20 years in terms of the flood risk? Has that gone up dramatically due to climate change? It's about the same.
Sorry, is this for the next paper for the Blackford An Invergowrie question, is that a question for that, or is this a general question for the presentation?
It's regarding the paper. That's what I put in the chat box.
If we can just take questions on the presentation just now for that Peter Dixon has done, then we will come to the actual paper for Blackford and Invergowrie after that. Do you have any questions for Peter Dixon? Thanks. I'll keep you in the list for the next time, Councillor Coogan. Councillor Cuthbert.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Peter. A very interesting presentation. Sitting on the planning committee, we quite often get sent videos and photographs of flooding, which don't seem to be included in flood risk, and SEPA doesn't necessarily comment. Specifically, I'm thinking about the back crook and Crook of Devon, and recently we've got an application coming in for Drum, and I've been sent a lot of photographs on that. How do we deal with that? I mean, in principle, if SEPA hasn't commented, is it something we bring to yourselves, or do we? I mean, basically, they show massive flooding in the area that the planning applications might be happening. So I'm just wondering how to deal with it.
Yes, I mean, obviously, the sort of approach to this, the Scottish planning policy, flooding as a material consideration in planning applications has to be considered. The council's local development plan's got policies in terms of flooding, and we also have supplementary guidance to the local development plan in terms of flooding and drainage, which gives developers advice on that. So what generally happens is developers will have to submit a flood risk assessment in support of any application, so that will look probably more at things like river flooding. They also have to produce a drainage impact assessment to look at surface water flooding and provide proposals for sustainable urban drainage systems. So any surface water that gets generated within their development site, you know, by roads and roofs, etc., runoff has to be gathered and managed within the site and only released at a slow rate, which will be equivalent to the sort of pre-development level. Part of the trick with this obviously is trying to get that information, that local information, into this process. So we will give our advice to planning on that. We'd be consulted by the council's planners on, you know, any plan application where there is a potential flood risk. Hopefully we've got good records. We have a lot of reports, databases, etc., of information full of photographs, the kind of information you're talking about there, that we can bring to that. We might have old flood studies, we might be doing flood scheme investigations, so we can bring all that into the process. And, you know, members of the public contact us as well all the time with photographs and information about flooding, so hopefully we can build up that information. And I think when plan applications you know, put on the council's website, neighbours are notified, and, you know, people can raise flooding issues at that time as well. So it's really just a matter of trying to get the best knowledge that we have at any particular time before we make these decisions on these applications, and hopefully we do have a good level of input. Certainly from our team. SEPA do comment on some of the bigger applications. They don't leave all. I think most of the smaller ones, they've got a protocol in place now, they don't comment on. But certainly we will. I know Scottish Water comment on a lot of these planning applications as well.
Yes, quite happy with that, Councillor Lane.
Thanks. If you're a statutory consultee, you would think you would have to comment, and to say no comment when it's something as important as flooding seems to be, and I've not sat in planning often, but I've read through planning reports, and often from Scottish Water, no comment, SEPA, no comment, and that is used at committee well, that there can't really be a problem there because they are statutory consultees with all the government funding behind them that are saying that there's not a problem. Have we ever done a review of the consultees' responses to planning and how that's affected decisions being made? Say over the last 5 years, where they've just said no comment, and then there has turned out to be a problem or not. Do we review the performance of our consultees?
Can I just, Barbara Renton's going to answer that question.
Thank you, Convener. Councillor Lang, I am not aware of that, but I would need to check with our planning colleagues and we would come back to you.
Right, thanks. Councillor Jack Welch.
Hi, thank you, convener. Thank you, Peter, for a very clear presentation. It was quite illuminating. I've taken it from what you've said that the catchment area for these river systems is critical, and it's just to sort of confirm and my understanding of is the landowner then has legal responsibility for flooding. For what in that context? Is it excess water? How do we define what excess water is? How do we measure it? Because obviously certain landowners who have forestry maybe perform a role of delaying or reducing floodwaters. Owners that maybe have moorland predominantly, that maybe is part of the problem. And is there then some form of carrot and stick to encourage land use changes and modifications that ultimately stop the taxpayer having to sort of do these capital intensive infrastructure projects that actually are at the end of the problem, not at the start of the solution? And I guess finally, are we working with any landowners as part of the objective target areas?
Yep. I'll try and remember all the different answers to your question there. Yeah, obviously the identification of catchment areas is quite important, and that I think the hydrological catchments are well set out, and the sub-catchment areas which we've got in these PPAs and these OTAs now. So there's been a lot of work done in that. So it's fairly well identified, and the science behind there's a flood estimation handbook we can work out, and get a good handle on river flows and surface water flows. So there's a reasonable understanding of that now. In some of the flood studies we do, there's more intensive localized modelling done to really get to the heart of that as best we can. In terms of the general responsibility is land and property owners are primarily responsible. The Flood Act gives the statutory authority certain powers to go and do things. Clearing water courses is one of them. Building flood schemes is obviously another. Doing these plans is another one. But those responsibilities, rest squarely with the landowners. I hasten to say sometimes councils are landowners as well, and that makes us. So landowners have to be responsible. So it's things like just clearing out water courses is a good way to try and kind of manage flood risk, making sure your land's well maintained. If you're a farmer, try and plough cross slope. Don't put the furrows up and down the slope in your farm. The water can just run off then. So quite often simple things can be done. Just basic landowners, land management techniques, that kind of thing can really help. The legal situation is a bit difficult. You do have to accept water from upstream as part of your land ownership responsibilities. But if a landowner does take action which increases the amount of flow coming onto your grounds, maybe then you've got a bit of a legal case then, and that's difficult because you're then into legal action, and individual landowners taking legal action against another, and that can be slow and a bit fraught and difficult. But yeah, totally accept how we kind of mobilising landowners to do things so that we are not having to come in at the back of that and do these big capital projects. Absolutely. Well, we do work with landowners where we can. There isn't really a carrot and stick. We can't force private landowners to do things. It's more about the science, the discussion, the negotiation, trying to cajole, persuade, that kind of thing, trying to raise awareness in the first instance, I suppose, and work with people, set out what councils and Scottish Water and SEPA can do and what we'd expect landowners to do. Give advice often is the thing that we do most of, I suppose. But we certainly will work with landowners in the catchment. Aelith, for instance, was one area where we looked upstream in the catchment, contacted farmers, etc. Contacted the Forestry Commission. They obviously have a problem with water running off their land. They kind of view tree planting as a good thing. It holds water back, and it does. It's true to a certain extent. The problem they have then is when they get into felling and the land is stripped of the trees, and then you get runoff. But they're much more aware of that now, and they again, it's land management techniques, trying to provide rural suds and drainage in areas and looking at the phased felling and looking at the potential impact of that now. So I think Forestry Commission are much better at being far more aware of that and really taking care about the way they plan out the felling operations. They don't just strip the whole hillside bare now. And there's obviously a blockage risk. If we get timber entering watercourses, it can block culverts and bridges, causing flood risk. Again, Ailith was badly affected by that a few years back as well. So up in the Ailith catchment, we worked with them and they took a lot of the fallen timber out of away from the watercourse, off the floodplain. If it's up the hill, it's fine. They can just leave the timber fall where it is. If there was any risk of it getting into the watercourse and getting swept downstream, they've moved it or tied it and secured it. So, you know, it's just kind of slowly with these things, really, and trying to do whatever we can with landowners, wherever we can, really.
Yeah, Peter, this is really helpful. I'm conscious it's quite a complex subject, and maybe I should try and catch up with you separately just to see if there's anything I can do within my own sort of ward. But I appreciate that comprehensive reply.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And just can I just ask if both members and officers can keep questions and answers succinct? We do have to bear in mind that there's another committee this afternoon, and we don't want to overrun too much. Councillor Lane, do you still have a question?
Oh, I've got several, but I'll just give one just now.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was just first of all, I'll comment on, you know, about clearing water courses, Peter. But if you go around clearing all the ditches and the burns, etc., out, you just get the water to the bottom quicker, which causes more of a problem. Would that not be the case that, you know, just to clear everything out to a quick running channel, it can cause more of a problem at the bottom than actually leaving vegetation, etc., in some of the water courses?
Yeah, absolutely true. So we're very mindful of that now, and we have to consider if we are going to clear a body of water, what the implications of that are. And I think the Flood Act actually lets us set that duty aside, I think, where we think that, you know, carrying out clearance works would actually increase flood risk rather than trying to reduce it. So yeah, we definitely have to make those decisions and those assessments before we do any clearance works.
Thanks. And supplementary, please, if you'll do, because that followed on from the last answer, was that, and I was pleased to see you mentioned about farmers ploughing round the hill so that you've not got a V shape to the gate where everything runs down the drill quickly. I noticed in one of the earlier slides it was all the people working together, land management. That is there not? Would there not be value of having the NFU as one of the people sitting around the table so they could disseminate information to their members, because land management, they cover a lot of it, and it's normally at the top of the chain for the water to come down, the water course, and I thought they might have been useful sitting on your committee.
Yeah, they sit on the there's area advisory groups for Tay and the Forth, so they're certainly represented on them, and within the national, there's a national flood advisory group as well that they sit on. And obviously we speak to farmers and NFU and any sort of specific projects that we run on, and there's some discussions recently in Blairgowrie with them to see if they could get involved with one or two farms where we're getting a bit of a problem with runoff as well. So yeah, they're certainly involved in the mix.
Good, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor McEwen, you have a question?
Thank you very much, Convener. You know, the Flood Act in the report you've discussed talks a lot about river catchment and burn catchments and them going into spate with heavy rain, etc. But obviously the recent flooding we've had is this flash flooding, urban flooding. And you know, I suspect that our current processes and procedures just don't fit this type of flooding and the frequency in which it's occurring. And I wonder what you think of that. You know, you talked there previously about uphill catchment, not increasing the catchment of the people below you. Well, you live in an urban environment. You know, your catchment's the streets and the roads. Well, in your little property down the hill, you don't have any responsibility or ownership or influence on the catchment above you, which is all concrete and tarmac and everything else, and this just runs down the hill. So how a house owner can be responsible in the urban environment for flash flooding to their property in the same way that we do for river catchment flooding? I just don't see that the two things are the same, and I wonder whether the two things need pulled apart, and we need different legislation and responsibilities and rules for the two different circumstances, especially going forward with the climate change and the weather pattern changes.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor McCune. Yeah, I would agree. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. You know, updates, reviews of legislation to try and tackle surface water flooding personally, and it is just a personal view, I think that is justified. It's a difficult part of the process we've got. They understand the river flooding and the means to try and tackle that are fairly well established. Surface water flooding is a bit of a newer bit of the flood risk management you know, kind of process. In saying that, we have, you know, in Perth, for instance, there's been a big exercise done with Scottish Water to do an integrated catchment study. We've got quite a large model, covers the whole of Perth and Bridge of Erne now, and we've modelled surface water flooding, the sewer risk, and the risk from small water courses as well. So the degree of understanding is there, and we're on with a lot of surface water management plans. So they look at you know, if you basically assume that your drainage systems are full, how do you manage water on the surface? Can you route surface water away from properties and businesses? Can you, you know, get blue-green infrastructure in parks and things like that to store water so that it doesn't affect properties? Can you route the water away? Can you use roads, car parks, bits of waste ground, that kind of thing, to try and manage that? So that's certainly something we're on with at the moment. The downside of that is we often find that surface water flooding is quite shallow, and we don't really get the flood damages, which then let us get the flood benefits and let us get the cost benefit ratios up to justify the schemes. And this is something we've reported to, you know, SEPA and the Scottish Government, and I'm sitting on a group which is discussing surface water flooding and the way forward with this and what might be needed to be put in place in future years to try and tackle it a bit better and get a more effective response to it. But it's very difficult. There's not really a competent means yet of flood warning for surface water flooding. It just happens very quickly. It's very difficult to tackle, and then getting these longer term measures in place to try and deal with it are proven difficult as well. So it's a bit of a work in progress on that one. So yeah, I certainly agree with what you're saying on that.
Thank you. Martin?
Thanks. I want to come back to sort of the land use side, especially afforestation, and make a point and then ask a question. And the point is based on personal observation that the Tummel catchment over the last 5 years has seen quite significant either reforestation, felling and reforestation, or new afforestation involving vertical plough lines. Now, this, as I understand it, is regulated by the Forestry Commission rather than the Council, but the Council should be a statutory consultee. So flipping the earlier points about statutory consultee on its head, do we as a Council make comments in our role in trying to improve catchment management to other regulators? Because what will have happened in the Tummel over the last 5 years will have made it flashier and therefore more likely to flood catchment areas downstream.
Peter, are you able to?
I think, you know, if there was a forestry plan, it will come through the planning process. Quite often, you know, we might get a chance to comment at that stage. So I think there's been some examples of that. In terms of the Tummel catchment itself, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it may be that you're in a rural area and it may be okay to have runoff with the ploughing, you know, vertically up down the hill because there's nothing being affected. It could be in a remote area. There's no properties or infrastructure, homes or businesses being affected. But yeah, I'd certainly take the point that you know, if we can get involved in that and give that advice. And I think the Scottish Forestry and Forestry and Land Scotland are well aware of this now. And it's probably an ongoing thing for them to look at these catchments and manage them a bit better in future, and look at the drainage and the land management techniques if they are felling in those areas. So certainly in the meetings that I'm having with them and the discussions that we'll have, they are well aware of this. And I think there's just some new guidance published on this recently by them as well. So yeah, it's certainly something we're well aware of, and we will advise on wherever we can.
Can I just add, Barbara Renton's going to bring this up with our planning team as well, Martin, to have a look at how through planning we can help influence the applications as they go forward to deal with the mitigation. And that. Councillor Lane, you have another question?
Yeah, thank you, convener. And I know this is a really hard problem that you're dealing with, because flash floods is down to something new. It's the amount of water and how it's not easy to push uphill, so it's always going to be mitigation. But I was wondering, especially in the more urban areas, does our planning department charge developer contributions that they, at the moment, are they allowed to charge them to add additionality that is necessary to improve the drainage system in urban areas? Because obviously they're adding to the capacity, and we charge it for road infrastructure and we charge it for education for schools. So I wonder if there's a possibility that we could introduce developer contributions in areas where they're building above other populated areas that might lead to increased flooding.
Can't comment, Councillor Lang, whether they charge developers contributions. What I know, what does happen is that the developer, if he's going to develop a site, will have to manage the surface water runoff on that site and therefore put the drainage infrastructure in, and that's normally now through the legal requirement for a sustainable urban drainage system. Often that's a kind of storage area that will gather the surface water up and release it at a slower rate to a receiving drain or a water course. So that's the guidance around that is fairly well established, and obviously the developer will pay to put that infrastructure in. But as to whether or not we can charge them to put additional drainage infrastructure in, I'm not sure.
It's not additional, it's to, sorry Peter, but it wasn't additional, it's to improve the infrastructure further down off their site, because obviously it's running down roads and going into the out with their drainage system or their suds ponds or anything, but it's going into the general water system, which then runs downhill, and the improvements may need to be done further down the system. So I was wondering if there was any way. I don't know if we do it. I'm just asking a question.
Can I just step in here, please? Again, Barbara Renton's going to take this more a planning issue on where we can get contributions, and certainly something that I think is probably going to be changing with the National Planning Framework 4 as it comes forward, and some of the interpretations within that. That's still at a draft stage that was released recently, but Barbara will take this up with the planning department and get an answer back regarding contributions for downstream flooding infrastructure. Is there any more questions on this, on the presentation? Richard?
Thanks for that presentation, Peter. One of the things I would like to ask is if there's any opportunity for Perth and Kinross Council to do something a little bit differently here and actually take a whole systems approach rather than a localised flood management one. I'd suggest looking at the sensor array development that's currently in progress with the SIEC on the 4th. And it might be worth your while if you're looking for partners to do anything to speak to the SIEC people at Clickmannon who are looking to expand into the Tay Basin. So instead of just doing this, I don't want to use the word complacent, but it is slightly complacent that it's not an immediate local risk. But what's happening is that you're offloading the problem slightly further downstream, where you then have another scheme which then offloads slightly further downstream, and you end up with the situation like we saw on the Rhine, the Elbe, the Odra and the Vistula, where huge amounts of money had been spent by various cities, and as soon as you got past their flood management scheme, it then spills over into the surrounding countryside. But because there are fewer people there, it doesn't matter that much.
Peter, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure about SIEC. I'd have to go and look up what. I'm not aware of that, or the work in Clickmannon. I think the process set out under the Flood Act, as I explained, if you remember the diagram with the catchment from the headwaters down to where the river meets the sea, we do work across entire catchments, and we're only putting these actions in where, and it's normally done through things like modelling, where we can show that we're not increasing flood risk downstream, so we don't put flood schemes in which then just move the problem elsewhere. We'll have to kind of deal with the flood risk within the flood scheme, so quite often we'll ensure that the flood scheme provides some additional storage, for instance, to mitigate the flooding. So there's quite a lot of work done around ensuring in a lot of detail that we aren't just passing the flow on and moving it somewhere else. And quite often the calls we get from communities and from the public, can you do things quickly? And quite often the reason we sometimes can't just get on and do things quickly is because we've got that problem of just moving flood risk somewhere else, and we have to really explore the ways of trying to manage and reduce the flooding without just moving it downstream, really. So I think that's fairly central to the Flood Act thing. But if there's something else at the SIEC you mentioned, yeah, we can certainly look into that as well and see what that can bring to it.
Thank you. This, as part of the Climate Change Commission and how we look and address climate change and adapting to the changing climate. This is the idea behind the Commission, that they will challenge us on thinking out the box or looking at new ways, finding innovative solutions to deal with the increasing impact that climate change is having upon all our communities. So I very much appreciate your questions and suggestions, and they will be taken forward. If there's no more questions, I just finally thank Peter Dixon for your presentation and answering all the questions, and your team for the work they do in dealing with the forward planning for flooding, but also dealing on the ground when we do have flood events as well.
Thank you.
Just going to move on to the Blackford and Invergowrie paper, and Barbara Dixon is going to introduce the Barbara Dixon. Barbara Dixon. Barbara Renton. Yeah, that's the dyslexia kicking in. Sorry. Apologies. Barbara Renton is going to introduce the paper.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, convener. You really don't want me to. Dixon, yes. Nope. You really don't want me to sing, but that would, sort of clear the room if that's an option that you would like at some point. This report describes the Council's flood protection studies at two separate locations, Blackford and Invergowrie. Both locations have experienced a history of flooding, most recently in February 2021 during Storm Dennis. Both communities remain at risk of flooding. The Forth and the Tay Estuary flood risk management plans were published, as Peter has just described in the presentation, in June 2016, and he has then described, sort of the arrangements for various flood studies. So the Council's third highest priority flood study was identified for Blackford, and a flood study was also set out for the Invergowrie area, and both studies included consideration of natural flood management, a set of techniques that aim to work with natural processes or nature to manage flood risk. The report to committee today recommends that a flood protection scheme is taken forward in Blackford, as it is deemed to be economically viable using industry standard assessment criteria. The preliminary proposals consist of a collection of localised actions, including diversion channels, flood walls and natural flood management measures. Unfortunately, the consulting engineer's report for Invergowrie has demonstrated that a natural flood management scheme is not economically viable, and hence the committee report recommends that no further work is undertaken on the development of this scheme. The consulting engineers have recommended a number of actions to mitigate flood risk in the area in the future. Separate public engagement events have been held to disseminate the findings of both flood protection studies. In addition, the committee report notes that the Blackford scheme has been submitted to SEPA for national prioritisation and has been included in the new Forth Flood Risk Management Plan published by SEPA in December 2021. The scheme will also be included in the next 4th Local Flood Risk Management Plan, due to be published in December 2022. This local plan should set out the proposed implementation arrangements for the Blackford flood scheme, including timescales and how it will be funded. Peter, in his presentation earlier, noted the ongoing Scottish Government COSLA review of capital funding for flood schemes and the other schemes that the Council is already progressing. The timescales and the flood and funding arrangements for the Blackford scheme therefore remain unclear for the time being. The next phase of work to develop the flood scheme proposals will therefore not commence until the funding review provides further clarity around capital grant funding and also provision made within the Council's capital programme. Happy to take any questions, Convener.
Councillor Kugali, have you down for 3 questions already? If anybody else has any questions, either please raise your hand or put a Q in the chat function. Councillor Kugali.
Yeah, so the first question I've got is, yeah, as I said earlier, is that both locations say there's a 0.5% chance of flooding to those homes. How much has that changed over the past, whether it's a decade, whether it's 5 years, due to climate change? Have we noticed a statistical change?
Peter, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Kugali. It will have changed. Whether we've noticed that, I mean, I think hydrologists in SEPA and some of the sort of national organisations like SIWEM and places like that will have done national studies into these kinds of things to basically show increases in flows. It's difficult because unless we'd done a hydrological assessment in Blackford and Invergowrie 10, 20 years ago, we don't really have anything to compare that against, but there will be some national reporting, I'm sure, done that somewhere. But what we have done is done the most up-to-date hydrological assessment we can, and then we also look at the future, so we can add, for instance, when we calculate a peak flow for the river, we can add a climate change allowance to that. And I know the climate change allowances have increased recently as well on the advice of the UK SIP programme and the guidance that SEPA have given us. So those have increased as well, looking into the future. So hopefully that at least partly answers your question.
Am I okay to get on with the second question then? That was helpful.
Given there's no more queues, please do carry on.
Yeah, so in both cases, the response rate to outreach from the council is very, very low, looking at 1 or 2%. Is that normal? And if it is that really, does that require a change of tact then? Because that's quite concerning if people aren't responding to letters and consultation.
Yeah, I mean, we do the best we can to put the information out there. We're trying to consult with communities, and I know for flood studies in particular, we do a questionnaire at the outset of the study. We share flood maps kind of halfway through, and then we'll normally have a couple of kind of community drop-in sessions towards the end. We're using the council's consultation hub, so I think we're doing all the right things to try and get messages out there. The right to communities to advertise that we're having these events, social media as well. We're trying to use everything that we can. I think it's just the nature of these things. There's a lot of people in the community who might not be affected by flooding, so don't respond. Some of them, I don't know, might be happy with the proposals and don't feel the need to respond. Others put their comments in. So yeah, we do find there's not always a massive response to these things. It would be nice sometimes to have more. I mean, on the overall flood risk management plan consultation last year, we've had 35 responses when conceivably there's 8,000 properties at risk. So there's not a massive level of engagement, but it's sometimes difficult to see what more we can do to put the information out. I'm just being reminded as well, obviously we speak to community councils and community resilience groups as well to try and get the message out in these things. So can be difficult, yeah, and the response isn't as high as we would sometimes like it to be.
No, I do appreciate it, and I know we spoke about Comrie a couple of weeks ago as well, because there does seem to be this this disconnect where the council's doing all the right things in theory, but it's not necessarily breaking through to a lot of people, and that might be a lack of effort on their part to go and look for the information. And when something comes through their door, they may not necessarily reading it before it goes in the bin. But it's something that's just a little bit of a worry in the back of my mind looking at those numbers. But the last question then I've got is if Invergary is now a vulnerable area.
I'm just going to move on and give other people a chance as well.
Yeah, that's something.
Councillor Lane, do you want to go to your first question?
It's going back to the last verbal update as well. The questions around, it said Comrie has already got funding in place, but the line above it said that, this was being reviewed. So we know that the UK government is reviewing all its capital projects, and the Scottish government's reviewing all its capital projects. And obviously we, as a local authority, will be reviewing all our capital projects. I was just wondering how nailed down the funding is when it said funding is in place for the £28 million project, but it said above that all these capital projects were being looked at.
Yeah,
and then that plays out for all these projects we're talking about, not just necessarily this one, Peter.
Yeah, I think the 3 projects, Comrie, Milnathort and South Kinross, have been through that review process, and COSLA and the Scottish Government said they're fine, money's allocated, on you go, carry on. So we've had the nod on those already. In terms of the national...
Sorry, Peter, and are they signed and sealed then, so that the costs are firmed up?
Yeah, I mean, we've already been getting capital funding for those, because we've been progressing these for a while now. We report the costs annually to the Scottish Government, and they give us grant funding for them already. So the council already has a good degree of the capital funding for these. So there isn't really a problem with those. The Schoon scheme, we've been asked to pause. It's a temporary pause. At some point, hopefully next year, the Scottish Government will say, you can progress with that, and the capital funding will come through. Nationally, the government have allocated £42 million a year to the flood risk management plans, and that was initially over the first 6-year cycle. Costs went up a bit, so they extended the 42 million for the first 10 years. So there's £420 million allocated. They've recently added another 150 million to that. And they're just looking at, kind of revisited all the schemes to say, right, this one can go ahead, this one can go ahead, that one might need to pause. That doesn't cover the cycle 2, the new schemes. So there's no funding solution to that already. So it's difficult to say what's going to happen with that. But I think for the schemes that we've got on the table, Comrie, Milnathort, Kinross, hopefully Schoon, the money will be there. And I know the Scottish Government, the ministers have written to COSLA just recently to say that they are still committed to delivering identified schemes, and they are committed to funding them. But the timescales for doing that might, not clear at the moment. So I think that's the issue.
Thank you, Peter. That will give comfort to a lot of people around there. The Scottish Government, even in these straitened times, are committing to this serious problem. Thank you.
Councillor Tom McCune, you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Firstly, after getting around the irony of building a flood defence around a factory that bottles water, my question sort of comes to, if I was a resident of Blackford, I see this 300-metre length support at the bottom of the burn there, sort of to protect the factory and the shops and the stuff that's there. If I was a resident there, I'd be asking the question of why is that not further up the hill? Is how future-proof is this current design, where their houses need protected in the future, or is what's the reasons that it's only the 300 metres at the bottom of the hill, really?
I'm not entirely sure the detail, Councillor McCune. I mean, basically what's been done is there's been a model created for the area. We've looked at potential flood risk and whether the flood might occur. And then the consultant engineers have looked at what they would have to put in place to manage that flood risk and to keep the water out of homes and to keep it out of businesses. And we don't really discriminate. We're trying to protect homes and businesses alike, and trying to give a kind of overall solution for a community. So, what's been set out is probably the best solution to try and achieve that. to provide a reasonable standard of protection in the future. And I think Blackford would look to climate change as well. So I'm going to invite Gavin Bissett, the engineer on our team, who maybe be able to give us a little bit more detail around that.
Yep, thanks, Peter. Thanks for your question, Councillor McEwen. Yes, as you've sort of highlighted, there is an element of hard defences that would have formed part of the consultant's recommended option that defends Highland Spring. But also alongside that, there are upstream sort of storage areas and diversions to take high flows out of the sort of at-risk watercourses and into areas where they don't cause a problem, essentially. So there is a wider sort of scheme other than just the hard defences at Highland Spring that ultimately defends all the receptors, the flood risk receptors in Blackford, up to a 0.5% flood event. Plus, we will consider the opportunity to explore sort of climate change as well, and how we mitigate against that. There's also an element of natural flood management that can be brought into the scheme, with other multiple benefits associated with that, which includes sort of cost savings by reusing some of the potential sort of excavated materials, and sort of habitat creation further upstream on the Allen Water. So there's quite a wide scheme being recommended by the consultants, but I suppose at this point it's just a feasibility study, and this is the sort of first stage. So there's a lot of work still to go into actually refining that option through the outline design stage, and ultimately taking it forward to something that we can potentially build. So hopefully that gives you a bit more clarity on the solution there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Gavin. Councillor Kugali, would you, the third question?
Yes, if Invergary is being classified as a vulnerable area and PKC aren't really dealing with it as much as they potentially could, I understand the metrics. Does that affect the insurance of people now living in those areas? And if so, can anything be done to mitigate that?
Thanks, Councillor Kugali. It shouldn't affect insurance premiums. I mean, one of the conclusions of the Invergary flood study is that actually, the assessment that's been carried out shows that less properties are at risk of flooding than we previously thought. So, in some way, that's almost a bit of good news for some property owners. The information that SEPA put out for the flood mapping, for instance, there's a sort of disclaimer on that, and insurance companies aren't actually allowed to use that to set insurance premiums. And to be honest with the insurance industry's got its own methods of assessment, which are probably quite detailed. Not in the least that they've got decades of records of insurance claims in an area, and they've probably got a fairly good handle on what the actual degree of flood risk is in any community. Without having to look at our flood studies and flood schemes and SEPA's flood maps, etc. So no, I don't think that is an issue. And there is advice we can give, like the Scottish Flood Forum, SEPA. There's advice out there on how to go about getting affordable flood insurance in place. There's a national scheme called Flood RE been set up, and basically insurance companies all nationally set aside a pot of money to make flood insurance affordable through that scheme. So, I mean, it might take a bit of shopping about, a bit of talking to your neighbours, going to a broker, but usually, residents should be able to get affordable flood insurance in place.
Thank you. Councillor Illingworth.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just start by commenting on the quality of how well this report is written? It's very, very clear. There's a clear executive summary at the start, and the report reads very well. That's a big boon. We don't get very long to read these reports, and it's really helpful that they're very clear to understand. My question is about the diagram of the map of the recommended option for Blackford. And it mentions flow control in a couple of places. Can you give me a brief description of what flow control means? What sort of devices are used?
Gavin, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Peter. Thanks for the question, Councillor Illingworth. At this stage, it could mean a variety of different sort of ways to sort of manage how much water is ultimately being passed downstream. So as part of the option, it's really to control what flows go down the Danny burn and the Back and Kinpoch burns into Blackford, where they can cause, obviously, or do cause issues currently. And the flow controls as part of the option would ultimately divert any high flows above these levels into receiving watercourses that have been assessed to be able to take it. It could be a simple sort of weir setup, or it may be something that we haven't really, we don't really have that level of detail at this point, but it's just basically a way of managing how much water is getting downstream and into Blackford at this point of the option. That's the level of detail we have.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cuthbert, you have a question?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'm intrigued by this concept of consulting with the insurance companies in terms of flood risk. I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like they've got a very comprehensive sort of statistical database, if you like. I'm just wondering, this kind of goes back to my previous question about Drum and Back Crook, that the consultations are made, then you get photographs coming in of flooding pouring down a hill or coming across a field. Is it something that we might consider for planning to consult with the insurance companies in addition to SEPA? I'm just really, this may be more Barbara, but it's more a planning question.
Again, Councillor Cuthbert, I'll speak to our planning colleagues and we'll come back to you on that.
Councillor Grant-Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I'm wondering about, we've been talking about capital monies and programme monies. Will there be ongoing cost to the council about when we divert burns, keeping them clear? Further ongoing costs?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Stewart. Yeah, I mean, usually when we implement a flood scheme, there's a small revenue budget set aside to maintain the scheme. So if there's, costs to be met, a common one is if we put a pumping station in, as we've got in the Perth flood scheme, there's a budget created to carry out the ongoing annual maintenance of that. And if we're having to do a bit more watercourse cleans, we can certainly make provision in the revenue budget for that. There's already our team have a cleanse and repair budget, so we do an annual programme of watercourse inspections, and we go and clear those bodies of water if they're blocked up. So we remove vegetation, garden waste, shopping trolleys, bread baskets, old tyres, all that kind of stuff. Any areas where we think that might create a flooding problem. So yeah, we're already well on top of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Councillor Welch.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, it kind of goes back to a comment that Councillor Lang made around contributions. So my understanding is there's some capital work's been spent effectively to prevent flooding associated with the Blackford Highland Spring plant. Ultimately, they are a significant landowner, effectively catchment in that immediate area, and they can, I guess, perform flood mitigation measures on their own land. So it seems a bit odd that these things aren't approached in tandem, and it's just to understand, is it the public purse that's essentially providing flood mitigation measures protection for a private company, but yet on one hand, you know, that company could actually be providing certain mitigation, you know, in their own right.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the permissive powers we have to promote flood schemes are, kind of my view of it, is a kind of community approach where you can go into a community and obviously deliver a flood scheme, and there's a community benefit from that, and you know that can benefit businesses as well as residents and other organisations. So you know, we don't really discriminate in that. We just do what we can in terms of trying to manage the flooding. But yeah, there is that question, and it's a good question. Should those companies and businesses who are probably well able to do something themselves, you know, we certainly would encourage Highland Spring to take action to protect their own you know, assets there. I haven't talked to them personally myself, but they might already have site protection plans and things like that in place, and certain measures that they take in terms of flooding. One thing we do often do, and we can't force it, is we ask for a contribution to a flood scheme from a business or a big landowner who will definitely benefit from it. So it's certainly something I think we would do here going forward as well. Gavin Bissett maybe can add a bit more to that.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we did speak to Highland Spring throughout the study as well, and yeah, had those very high level initial discussions about if they can take things forward. They seemed quite keen that they might want to take things forward themselves, and are quite keen to get their hands on the sort of final reports and things, obviously, so they can consider our study and how that may interact with any of their own plans. They have undertaken some works themselves just to defend their own site, but certainly with the sort of wider scheme, we have had some sort of higher level discussions with them, so they have been involved in the process.
Thank you. Can I just add a quick supplementary onto that one? Is there any ability or any prospect of Highland Spring or any other business or Transport Scotland with A9 of contributing to the costs of any scheme?
I think in general, Councillor Waters, we would look to seek out, yeah, if there's any opportunities, yeah, you know, any contributions we might be able to get, and any joint working that we can do with, you know, landowners, business owners, yeah, we would certainly welcome that wherever we can.
I think just to add on to that, Peter, and it kind of goes back to some of the questions that Councillor Welch has raised. There is a catchment group in the Blackford area, it's the Allen Water Steering Group, which is part funded by the Scottish Government, and it's largely led by the Forth Rivers Trust. We sit on that group and provide advice, but that group itself works with landowners and is quite heavily involved with, not necessarily Highland Spring, but as we know, Highland Spring and sort of subsidiaries of that own large amounts of land around Blackford. So those other sort of companies work with that group to look at their sort of land management practices in the upper catchment. So there's sort of wider projects that are offline from our scheme going forward currently as well. We take cognizance of that throughout the study, and will do as we move forward with any outline design on the recommended option. But yeah, I thought it was just worth highlighting that there is quite a lot of good work ongoing in the catchment, and it's often these groups that are best placed to sort of help push forward these land management sort of improvements. The Forth Rivers Trust and other sort of fisheries and things, they tend to have a good relationship with those who own large swathes of catchments and things, so they tend to be best placed to actually deliver sort of any benefit on the ground. So from my experience anyway.
Thank you. If there's no more questions, I will move this report. Scotland has adopted a new approach to manage the risk of flooding. To better plan and coordinate action on this, the Council is working closely with other public bodies to implement national strategies and local plans. These flood studies are some of the latest outputs from this ongoing process. They set out how flooding will be tackled in the future and how we will reduce the impact of our unpredictable weather. Implementing a flood scheme in Blackford will significantly reduce flood risk to the local community. However, this will take time due to current limitations on capital funding. There is no scheme proposed for Invergowrie. However, the study has confirmed that fewer properties are at risk than previously thought. The study has improved knowledge of flooding in this area, and the risk of ongoing flooding will continue to be managed via other actions in the Council's flood risk management plans. The findings from these studies have been discussed with both communities. A number of surface water flooding issues were reported by residents during community consultation for the Blackford flood study. A separate surface water flooding assessment was therefore also carried out as part of the flood study. The main areas affected by flooding were identified, confirming the residents' comments, and simple measures considered to help manage this in the future. Minor works have already been carried out, and these have already reduced the risk of surface water flooding at one location. This is a good example of positive action to resolve a problem quickly. I am happy to accept the recommendations within this report and move the paper for approval. Can I ask Councillor Barrett to second the report?
I second the report.
Do members have any comments on the report?
Yes.
Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Convener. Very briefly, I do know that the Blackford Community Council are very grateful for this report, and they do accept that it will be some time before it's put in place, but they really are grateful for all the hard work that's gone on behind the scenes.
Thank you. Do we have any more comments? We move the report. For item 6, can I pass on to Councillor Liz Barrett, who will be convening for this report?
Thank you, Convener. The next item is the Public Bodies Reporting Duties 2022 on carbon emissions. And can I please ask Davindy Grant, the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Team Leader, to introduce this report? Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Can everybody hear me today? Yes. Okay, good. This report provides an overview of the Council's annual climate change public bodies climate change duty reporting submission that we're required to submit to the Scottish Government. It includes an update on the Council's annual carbon footprint and emissions trends for the reporting year 21-22, along with the benchmarking information to inform decisions and ensure effective performance monitoring. The Public Bodies Climate Change Duty Report is key for the Council to understand how much progress is being made. It allows us to benchmark a performance with other public sector bodies and calculating our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Perth and Kinross Council's carbon footprint in 21-22 has increased in comparison to the previous year. This is, however, mainly attributed to the comparison with 2020-2021, where there's a significant drop in emissions identified associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on energy and transport. The latest comparable reporting year was 2019-20, and with respect to this, we had a 3% decrease in emissions. This year, several new reporting requirements were added, and the main one included setting interim and overall net zero targets for the Council. For this, we've put in 2045 as agreed in the Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan and put forward key Scottish Government statutory targets to be used as interim targets. However, over the next year, several key studies will be undertaken, including the non-domestic estate decarbonisation plan and the fleet EV transition plan, which will be key documents in enabling us to provide meaningful interim targets. And we're hoping next year to have more meaningful targets to provide to the committee. The report contains 4 recommendations for the committee. Firstly, to note the contents of the report, along with the contents of the public body's climate change reporting duty. To note the progress in developing benchmarking information and the need to use an evidence-based platform to inform decisions. And for members to request officers to develop a detailed decarbonisation trajectory before November 2023, and to develop a robust Scope 3 reporting methodology for the Council by November 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Davindi. Do members have any questions on the report? Councillor McEwen.
Thank you very much, Vice Convener. In the papers in item 4.8, it describes that DEFRA has changed its factor for calculating some of the emissions related to, I think it's the landfill, or rubbish that goes into landfill. Can I get a wee bit more detail around that? Because that seems to then make it really difficult to follow figures and have a baseline if somebody keeps changing the goalposts on us.
Andy, could you respond to that, please?
I only know the sort of high-level details of it. I don't know the details of what was behind this change for DEFRA. I know every year we do get small changes in the sort of the grid intensity factor, which is related to landfill and also and also towards the landfill. This year was more significant than it has been in previous. I can take it away to investigate further and report back. My preliminary guess is it may be associated to the inclusion of methane, which they've started to do in other public sector reporting, but I don't know the precise reason.
In general, do you just think this is, as the science advances, they're actually getting better at doing this generally? And
Yes.
That's why the methane's come into it, because we understand that production better than we did in the past.
Barbara Renton would like to, sorry. Barbara Renton would like to respond on this.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I think that the point that you're making about benchmarking and ensuring that we can measure against it, I think that that's one of the issues that we face with this as measures change, and understandably why measures change, because sort of nationally, internationally, those tighten up. I think that what we'll do is try and find a method of where we know that the measure has changed, while we want to provide some kind of benchmarking in the information in the future, is we will find some method of marking where those measures have changed, but able to sort of still indicate wherever we can whether we've improved or not.
Okay, Tom. Thank you, Barbara. We have a question from Councillor Jack Welsh.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Barrett. In section 4.11, table 2, it states that emissions from PKC non-domestic properties will need to have a 75% reduction by 2030. That I would expect is a hugely challenging target, and I understand obviously that council officers are going to be working on a plan to deliver that by, I think, November of next year. However, my question is as part of identifying the low-hanging fruit, which I suspect there's quite a lot of in council properties, is there baseline figures for building performance in terms of kilowatt hour consumption per metre square, and is it possible to publish that information on a building by building basis?
Thank you, Davindi.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, there is that information. It's held by my colleagues in the energy team. I can investigate with them if there's any reasons why it can't be published. But we can report back to you on this. But I would assume that it would probably be okay.
Yeah, or at least circulated, just so as you know, we then can understand where the actions are being taken on the worst performing buildings, if you like, because it may be as part of disposals of property that may influence any subsequent property disposals, if indeed that is a potential plan. As I say, the first question was just around this concern about trying to achieve a 75% reduction, and just any sort of comments at this stage on your concerns around that.
It will be a very, very challenging target to meet. In parallel to developing the decarbonisation plan, my colleagues have identified some low-hanging fruit. This is primarily associated with addressing the properties with oiled fire boilers due to the high sort of carbon intensity of these, and they've presented developed an interim plan for addressing these properties. And the funding for that was sort of included in the funding request for that was mentioned for the climate change annual report that went to council last week. But they are hoping to be able to progress with that next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Davindi. Could I just ask councillors not to chat in the chamber while someone's speaking? Thank you. Councillor Ling.
Thanks, Vice Convener. It's 4.5 bullet point 3. It's the indirect emissions which relate to council's activities, including waste. If we could get a definition of what that waste is, because I'm not sure, and home working, that would be helpful, because I'd like to cross-reference the home working with the transport. If it's an indirect, you know, getting people to work, to come to offices to work, is that included in the transport figure of the council or not? Because if we're including home working, I just need to know the relationship between the figures, or these how the figures are calculated. Thanks.
Yes. So in terms of waste includes all of our refuse, as well as sort of recycling and all of the other sort of waste streams we have. In terms of sort of working from home emissions and transport, right now our scope 3 emissions include, sort of based on what's the assumed number of staff working from home, a sort of figure to attribute their emissions from when they're working from home, but the transport only includes the emissions associated with staff when they're on council business and not getting to work. It's one of the areas of scope 3 emissions that we don't have the data right now to be able to calculate, and we've been working with HR to see if there's a way we can get that information. But we're looking as part of the revised scope 3 methodology that we're looking forward to next year. We're hoping to be able to include that in it.
Yeah, thanks, because I think that would give a more accurate figure, because we're building up the figure by including home working, but we're not reducing the transport figure by people working from home. So I find, you know, it's not giving an accurate figure. And it was just the waste. Is the waste just for, you know, council employees, or is it just council buildings, or is it everybody's waste?
So it's all of the council managed waste. So it's everybody's waste that the council manages, but it doesn't include the waste sort of collected by independent third-party organizations.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful then. So you're taking the waste figure and working it out. It's worked out by the tonnage, etc. It's going there. So from 2015, when we started, to 2022, how many more residents do we have in Perth and Kinross? Because obviously that would have a figure of how much each person's doing. It affects the total, because you're giving a total, but if there's another 5,000 people living in the area, the carbon footprint per person is actually going down by much more than the overall.
That is a good point. I will I do not have the figures to hand. I don't know if Barbara does, but we can consider it in future reports.
I think that, that makes, a very interesting point, Councillor Ling. I think that these are indicators that we are continuing to develop. I think that there are many factors. The basic thing that we really want to do is, no matter how many residents we have, is continue to reduce their waste. And think about how that impacts across the piece. But a per capita number would be interesting.
Yeah, and I know it's very new to be collating these figures and appreciate them, but it's just to, when I see something, it's trying to make them more transparent moving forward. And maybe it's also to show that we are making slightly better gains if it was done by per capita than it appears on the first pass. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Ling. I think part of the issue is that we still have to reduce our overall figures. So the number of people, I mean, does sound very interesting, but our goals are to overall for Perth and Kinross.
But I also think that per capita figure or per household figure would be interesting in terms of how we are persuading people to reduce their waste as well. So in terms of the education elements that the Climate Commission are particularly interested in, I think that's something, if people knew, and much more of a focus on thinking that this was just a generic issue, it's a personal issue about how much people are generating themselves. So I think that would be something we would want to explore.
Thank you, Barbara. Councillor Grant Stewart, do you have a question?
Thank you, Vice Convener. Davindi, thank you for your comprehensive answers, because you've headed off some other questions I was going to ask. Could I refer to 4.5 graph 1? And this could be on the back of my colleagues' questions, Councillor McEwen's and Councillor Lang's. By note, in 2015, 2018 and 2020, the graph went up. I see the totals come down over the years. I appreciate that we're just discussing there that this is a changing situation. It's quite dynamic and complex. Do these rises in those years, does that reflect in the different reporting of emissions?
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, they do. Especially the 2018-19 rise. That was when, for the first time, the council started calculating our Scope 1 transport emissions, so the emissions associated with our fleet, which is what caused that rise. The 2015 or the 2016-17 rise was due to sort of small tweaks in emissions factors.
Thank you, Davindi. And a question from Martin Mathers, please.
Just to support the comments made earlier about giving data as well per capita, because climate change is everybody's problem and everybody's responsibility. So it does help to communicate to people what their role might be in helping to mitigate.
Thank you, Martin. Are there any other questions? Councillor Anderson.
Just a quick one. 411. I was looking at plan to remove of oil as a fuel, heating and hot water and PKC estate, and all sites with oil heat to be removed by 2030. You're also I gather somewhere in a scheme, I saw something recently, when removal of no gas boilers or gas heaters not to be allowed in the estate shortly. Is it 2025 or something like that? You got no new gas boilers to be installed. Is the council going to assist people in the estate with solar energy or biomass, comprehensive biomass units to help to reduce the cost of living? Because electricity is possibly the price of fuel you're left with, according to this report as such. Have you ways of reducing that cost to the occupiers of council tenants, council properties?
So yes. So I suppose this report is referring to the council's non-domestic estate, but the same 2025 threshold for removing or for no new gas-fired boilers comes in, also applies to the domestic estate. With these, and Martin Mathers in the room is the expert, but when you look at what the Energy Saving Trust has, sort of what their figures are, oil is the most expensive heating fuel currently, and so if you were to be switching from oil to heat pumps, it's actually projected that you would have a cost saving for residents. Where you make a sort of more significant benefit is if you put solar panels in combination with a heat pump, then they can start to sort of really help residents with fuel poverty. Compared to a sort of gas boiler, it's not comparable, but with the current prices of oil, it's not increasing the sort of cost burden on them. But my colleagues in the property team are looking at ways that they can make sure that none of the interventions will sort of increase the fuel poverty burden on residents.
Thank you. Are there any more? Oh, sorry, Martin. I keep looking around the room and looking in the chat. Thank you. Thank you.
Having just been nominated as the expert by Davindi, thank you very much. Yeah, there's quite a lot of work going on both within the council and elsewhere to look at what the most sensible routes for decarbonising home heating are. My other hat, I manage the Heat Project, which is a charity part funded by the council. We are just completing a study looking at retrofitting of heat pumps combined with solar power to domestic houses, which looks economically extremely attractive. The wrinkle there is that while heat pumps at current prices of gas to electricity just about break even, but they're a much higher capital investment. That will change over time. We anticipate that gas will become relatively more expensive compared to electricity, and that would favour heat pumps more and more. But the wrinkle is that houses have to be of a good energy efficiency standard to make heat pumps work properly, because they run at a lower temperature than gas central heating. Quite a lot of the council's own housing estate is probably already at a sufficient standard to allow heat pumps to work effectively. So that gradual retrofitting when gas central heating needs to be replaced with heat pumps combined with PV might be a very, very sensible way for the council to be meeting its climate change obligations and making sure that tenants are not in fuel poverty.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I think Barbara would like to add.
I am conscious that, sort of this paper is about the non-domestic council estate, but it's just to add the reassurance, sort of that we've had from Davindi and from Martin about the work that housing colleagues, and no surprise there, are doing to ensure that wherever possible that we meet these targets.
Thank you. I've lost my screen now. Excuse me a second. I think if there are no other questions, can I sorry. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to move the report. This report provides an overview of the Council's annual Climate Change Public Bodies Climate Change Duty PBCCD reporting submission. It includes an update on the Council's carbon footprint and emissions trends for the reporting year 2021 to 22, along with benchmark information to inform decisions and ensure effective performance monitoring. This report is complementary to the report which was included in the first Climate Change Annual Report and was approved by the Council last week. The public body's climate change duty reporting on climate action and carbon emissions is key for the Council to understand how much progress is being made and allows us to benchmark our performance with other public sector bodies as well as previous years. Our understanding of how to calculate scopes 1, 2 and 3 emissions needs to improve despite its complexity and ever-changing criteria, as was referred to in the questions. I'm very pleased to move this paper for your approval. Can I ask Councillor Richard Waters to second the report?
I'm happy to formally second the report.
Thank you. And comments on the report, Councillor McEwen.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I think this report highlights the need for this committee in some way, and that it's always a learning day when we have these type of papers coming forward for us as councillors, and I think as officers as well, and it demonstrates in trying to tackle the climate emergency and improve our carbon footprint as we've been asked to do, that we need to understand the processes and the measurements better, and as we move along, and it's a progressive journey. And this, I think, this paper indicates that that's the case, and that we're learning and improving and adapting as we can with the knowledge and experience, and that without this process, I don't think we'd make much headway on the climate change. We would be greenwashing if we weren't actually doing something to actually explore and advance our own knowledge and our own understanding.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. Councillor Kogali.
Yes, I'd like to thank the officers for bringing the paper. It is encouraging to see that there is progress, albeit maybe not as rapid as everybody would like, but these changes will take time and it is hard. I would like to say that despite agreement across the chamber about the massive challenges, and we obviously need new ideas, that again, when opening these papers and looking at the agenda, I was really disappointed again that there's still no massive new ideas that we were all promised. And being brutally honest, I really, really did hope that that's what this committee was going to bring. And yet again, it's not there. We keep getting promised that it will come at some point in the future, but we're running out of time. We're always talking about that. And whether it's the meeting after this one, whether it's the meeting after that, we need these ideas eventually. I'm sure the leader of the council and the convener are going to tell me that it's coming and say something about bipartisanship, but we really, really do need to see them soon. But again, thank you to the officers for bringing it. It's good to see that there is progress, but we need to be doing all we can to speed that up.
Thank you. The climate emergency is before us. There's no magic wand fix to this. You seem to think that there's some magic wand. There's a lot of them are small changes we need to make. We had a paper come before council, full council, with the strategy and action plan that came before council last week, which set up a paper that officers have worked at very hard to produce, which is our strategy and on our path to net zero. And it is a path, and part of the papers that are coming forward here are part of that path and how we're going to address the climate emergency. They are important papers. We need to. The strategy is there to try and to get it. One of the major challenges we're facing in delivering that is the finances. We are all hopeful that you know, the finances at the UK level will be released down, so we will be able to invest the money in our strategy and we'll be able to deliver on the strategy that has been created. We have to wait and see. There's a lot of concerns about that over that, which were very well documented and expressed last week. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Councillor Ling.
Thank you. Before I go on to comment the paper, I'd like to say that as we were talking about per capita early, it's everybody's responsibility. And the most disappointing thing for me is that we seem to, as some elected members seem to appear, do not, any idea they've got, they can go to any officer. Officers are very available. So I think it's incumbent not to come along and expect others to be doing everything without putting forward an idea themselves. Councillor Kigali has mentioned this 3 times now, and I'm waiting to see for his first big intervention idea and not just coming to the committee to talk about nobody else coming up with an idea. So hopefully he will have the next big idea that we can all discuss. To go back to the paper and the report, I think it's a start for 10 to show where we are at Perth and Kinross, and it's showing where our ambition is to go, because we can't do this ourselves. I think we're only about 3% or something of the total carbon footprint. But we've got to be leading by showing we're moving, and we've got to take people with us, as was spoken earlier by Martin, and that like per capita, it's everybody's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility in this room. It's everybody's member of the public's responsibility, and it's really the responsibility of elected members who sit on this committee to help to drive things forward. And hopefully that we can all take that away from today, that we'll go away and we'll look for best practice across the world, basically, and bring it back to Perth and Kinross. So thanks to the officers for bringing the paper, and thanks for having an interesting discussion today on where flood schemes are, etc., that may not have come to any other committee. I'm very happy with the way this committee is moving forward, and with the Climate Change Commission and what it's going to feed into it. And I think anybody that talks down what Perth and Kinross Council is trying to do has a very strange kaleidoscopic view of what we're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ling. Are there any more comments? Just make sure I haven't missed anyone this time. If there are no more comments and there is no amendment, can I ask if we can please agree the recommendations in this report?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Yeah, just thank you everybody. Thank you, officers, for your contribution to the papers today, and thank you for all the members as well for your contribution as well. I formally close the meeting. Thanks.